Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. So I was asked to make a video about Harold Macmillan, or Maurice Harold Macmillan, as I should probably call him. He always went by his middle name, I'm not sure why. And there were other British Prime Ministers who did that, use their middle name, for instance, James Callaghan, Leonard James Callaghan. So Macmillan was born in London in 1894 to a British father and an American mother. So his great-grandfather had been a crofter in the Western Isles of Scotland. Not his grandfather, as he liked to claim. I think his grandfather had been born there, but had moved away, had become a bookseller in Cambridge, eventually a publisher, done quite well. And his father had gone to Cambridge University, if I've got that right, was a teacher at Westminster School, one of the most estimable schools in the realm. And then Macmillan Publishing really took off and exists to this day. So they were reasonably affluent when Harold Macmillan was born, and he had at least one brother. So I read his autobiography when I was a schoolboy, and he was brought up in the Church of England. His mother was rather anti-Catholic and would condemn things as Jesuitical at the time. And about that Macmillan Publishing House still goes to this day. Then his grandson, David Faber, was obviously the progeny of Macmillan's daughter with someone, a scion of another publishing house. There's Faber and Faber, another famous publishing company. So that David Faber, his grandson, was headmaster of Summerfield's Prep School, which is in Oxford. I'm not sure if he's still there. He certainly was there about 2010, a former Conservative MP who didn't rise to great rank. Nothing grows in the shadow of a great oak tree. As Winston Churchill's son later said, if you have an extraordinarily accomplished pater, it's very difficult to measure up. And anything you do achieve will be said, oh, that's just because his dad opened doors for him, which might be true. Anyhow, coming back to Harold Macmillan, I'm not sure which prep school he went to, but he was a King's Scholar at Eton, a tug, as they used to call them, as in they wore a toga, like a gown. So Eton consists of 1,300 boys, about 70 of whom are King's Scholars, and they put KS after their name. Seems very conceited that you could be 13 years old and having that name. So, and then his brother was with him, certainly had a homosexual liaison with, I think it's John Maynard Keynes, was also a King's Scholar at the same time. If I got it right, it's Macmillan's older brother. I can't remember the older brother's name, actually. So Macmillan, who was to win that scholarship, was extraordinarily academically gifted. Having said that, in those days, the scholarship exam was only in classics, Latin and ancient Greek. And that was thought to be the vital thing. If you weren't good at classics, you just weren't clever. Even if you were outstanding at mathematics, even if you were gifted at modern languages or were brilliant at English, if you weren't good at Latin or Greek, you just weren't smart. Then you were part of the clerisy. So then he had no difficulty winning a scholarship to Oxford University. He went to Balliol, if I've got that right, as in one of the colleges of Oxford. And so I'm not sure he was terribly sporty. He was always slim. He kind of looked a bit older than he was, maybe because he had these prominent teeth, these sort of buck teeth or whatever, an overbite. No, that's undershot, sorry. No, why do I keep doing it wrong? Like that. I forgot to say that he played in the Wall game, the St Andrews match in 1909, when the last time a goal was scored. Okay, the Wall game's a sport at Eton that's played beside College Field, and there's the furrow, as in it's a furrow long, roughly 100 metres long, and about 5 metres wide, and it's more or less a scrum in that very narrow strip of land for an hour. There is a half time. It's exhausting, 10 aside. An 11th man who watches, takes notes, and delivers a speech about it afterwards. That should be my position if I got to play that match. So college, as the King's Scholars, wearing purple and white stripes, play against the Oppidans as everybody else. Obviously, there's only 10 selected from each side, in orange and purple. So Oppidan Wall plays against College Wall, and he played in that match, and a goal was scored. It's very difficult to score a goal. You've got to get a shy. I think I explained it actually when I was at Eton sometime. I did a video on how to play the Eton Wall game. Getting the ball beside the wall in the scoring zone towards the end of the other team's half and raising up with your ankle off the ground a bit and touching it with another hand and saying, got it. And the umpire will say, yes, that's a shy, that's 1 point. Pick up the ball, you have a chance to throw it at a goal. Good calcs or bad calcs. Good calcs at the end near Eton, there's a black door you have to hit with the ball with. And the other end, bad calcs, there's a tree you have to hit with the ball with. there's a white line. I have to hit it on the stump, as in below that white line. Things like that. Calx is its Latin for chalk. And that the slough end is bad calx because there's only a wall to its side, not to its rear. Anyway, he played in that match. He didn't actually score the goal. So that's the last time a goal was scored in the St Andrews Day match. Goals have been scored in other matches, but not the St Andrews Day match, which is between Oberton Wall and College Wall. Anyhow, so he went to Balliol. He got involved in the Oxford Union Society, which is a debating society of Oxford University. And he showed a lively interest in political affairs. And he was elected president of the Oxford Union. And so the most prominent undergraduate in the university. There were only about 3,000 people at the whole university in those days. And just about to take over, he was elected president. The summer holidays came. He was going to come back in the Michaelmas, as in October, to assume the presidency. However, the First World War intervened, and he felt his patriotic duty to volunteer for the British Army. So he joined the Grenadier Guards, this socially elite regiment. The officers were often very pucker, although he has been to Eton. Well, maybe wasn't even that well off, wasn't an aristocrat anyway, but served with great distinction on the Western Front. And people said he was valorous, if only he could be as brave as Mr. Macmillan. Subalterns were often known as Mr. And several of his friends were killed, and several of them, others who survived, were maimed for life. And he often said he never would have become Prime Minister if all the truly talented people hadn't been hewn down in the First World War. So he survived the war, traumatized by that. And then he was made aide-de-camp to the Duke of Devonshire, who went to be Governor-General of Canada. And he ended up getting engaged to her daughter. He could have gone back to Oxford, but he chose not to. He said it was a city of ghosts for him, for so many friends who had fallen in the Great War. So he married, he had a number of children. One of his daughters was called Dorothy. But the other thing I recall from his autobiography is he said that he remembered the 1904 Russia-Japanese War very distinctly, and his sympathies lay very much with the Japanese, partly because Japan's position in relation to the Asian continent was analogous to the British Isles' position relative to mainland Europe. So they were an island people, plucky, the little Japanese, as they were physically diminutive. That lent all the more credit to them for besting the Ruskies. And the Russians were seen as really a nemesis. But anyway, back to the 1920s. Then he decided to go into politics, and he was elected member of Parliament, represents Stockton-on-Tees. That's in northern England. The River Tees is near Durham. And anyway, it was quite a deprived area. The slump really hit it in the 1920s. Demobilised soldiers couldn't get jobs. Homes fit for heroes. That's what the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, had said, the last Liberal Prime Minister. Seemed like a sick joke. So he wasn't the hardline capitalist that many Conservatives were. Why did he become a Conservative? Didn't seem to be particularly Conservative. Maybe because he had excellent contacts there. So that just opened the door to Parliament, and he wasn't going to pass up this golden opportunity was offered to him. But he was very much a moderate Conservative in the one nation tradition that Disraeli set up. A wet, as people might have said in Thatcherite times, believed there should be a middle way. He even wondered whether they should break away and form a middle-of-the-road party with some moderate Labourites, perhaps a few Liberals. In the end, that didn't happen. And of course, the Great Depression hit his constituency very hard indeed. Perhaps surprisingly, he wasn't unseated by the Labour Party, because after that became very fertile ground for the Labour Party. Anyway, he was an anti-appeaser. The Second World War came, and there was Churchill's minister plenipotentiary in North Africa, like as in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, French possessions at the time. So it's quite controversial right after the Second World War, towards the end of the war, before the Labour government came in. There's agreement that Soviet citizens who'd served the Axis must be repatriated to the Soviet Union. The UK was aware that obviously the Soviet Union's trials were completely unfair, that used torture on an absolutely gigantic scale, that people could be executed for trifling offences. Nevertheless, it was felt essential to remain on the right side of Stalin, and so some of these people were repatriated. Some of them Cossacks included. You could read Count Tolstoy's book about it. The Minister and the Massacres. I've met him. Caused sort of a civil war in the Tory party in the 1980s. And some of these people have been born outside the Soviet Union, been born after the October Revolution, outside the Soviet Union, or born maybe before 1917 in the Russian Empire, had never been Soviet citizens, so how could they be accused of treason? But nevertheless, they were sent to their fate, knowing they'd been dispatched to their doom. It was something that some of the British soldiers sent them back found nauseating. Others felt, well, they were enemies of ours, so let them suffer, or they were traitors or whatever. And remember, the Soviet stock was quite high in the UK after the First World War because, of course, the Red Army tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht. People in the West don't like to acknowledge that the Red Army did most of the fighting and that the Western Allies would not have won without the Soviet Union, would not. Anyway, so the Conservative Party was obviously in opposition from July 1945. They'd lost to Clement Attlee's Labour government, but the Conservatives came back surprisingly quickly. That first Parliament lasting up to 1950, the Conservatives didn't gain a single seat in by-elections. Remember, opinion polls were relatively new, so by-elections were considered a very important barometer of public opinion, much more so than they are today. But it was a severe winter of 1947, almost sunk the Labour government. Rationing had to be tightened. Bread had never been rationed during the war. It was so plentiful. That had to be rationed. And 1950, Labour squeaked home. 1951, Labour got a plurality of the votes, but not the seats. The Conservatives were back in. Very unlucky the way the parliamentary arithmetic broke down that time. Because had Labour won, they would have inherited the post-war boom. Attlee could have served on to 1955 when rationing was being got rid of. He could have handed over to someone like Hugh Gaitskell in 1955. Churchill would have been yesterday's man. And maybe Labour would have been the natural party of government, as Harold Wilson later aspired to make them. Anyhow, so the Conservatives came back in 1951, and it was clear that Churchill's days were numbered. He had a stroke pretty soon afterwards and was really increasingly gaga, so just about managed to hold it together. His son-in-law, Rupert Soames, sometimes forging his signature because Churchill couldn't write. There was no 24-hour news cycle, and the media was distant, deferential. So even the things that were whispered about in establishment circles, no Fleet Street editor would dare allow this into his newspapers. So Churchill really should have retired sooner, but he stepped down in 1955. And by this time, Harold Macmillan was Chancellor of the Exchequer, as in Finance Minister. And he was mentioned in his mother's hometown in the United States. I forget where it was, somewhere in the Midwest. He's Chancellor of Britain's Exchequer, because I've seen the cartoons from it. I recall that from this book I read a quarter of a century ago. I'm hypothymesic, as you can see. I've got an extreme autobiographical memory, because if something makes a profound impression on me, I'll recall it for the rest of my life. I can remember some of the precise words that were said to me, or I said when I was 3 years old, but I couldn't remember quite important organisational things about my timetable. No short-term memory. I exaggerate only a little. I remember for life, or not at all. So anyhow, his wife was increasingly unfaithful to him. Apparently he was not. It didn't seem to bother him, almost a willing cuckold. This rumour got around that his daughter Dorothy was actually sired by someone else, but apparently that's untrue, that she was told at a party when she was 19, oh, by the way, your father is blah, 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 Lord Boothby or something, and that really messed her up, and then she was impregnated by some other man that had an abortion at the time, illegal. I'm not sure if that's all true, that bit, but certainly his wife played around. That's widely accepted by historians. But again, the newspapers wouldn't touch it, being a very different era, rather straight-laced. So then came Suez. I don't want to tell the whole Suez story, but 1956, the Franco-British-Israeli attack on Israel over the Suez Canal. Now, as a member of the cabinet, this collective cabinet responsibility, Macmillan supported Eden to the hilt over that one. But anyway, it turned out to be a diplomatic calamity, and the objective was not achieved from Britain's perspective, did not regain control of the Suez Canal, had to hand over to United Nations troops a face saver, and the UK's reputation was mud in much of the Muslim world, or the post-colonial world, and in all socialist states. So then a couple of months later, Eden fell on his sword. Sir Anthony Eden retired on health grounds as Prime Minister. He wasn't that ill. He lived on for a further 20 years, and Macmillan then took over. The Magic Circle decided that he would be the leader. Shall it be Harold or shall it be Rab? Some people thought R.A. Butler should be MP, as initials were R.A.B., known as Rab. But Rab Butler hadn't been to Eton. Some people said that. There was no formal election. A leader was said to emerge. Even the Conservative MPs didn't get to vote, bizarrely. So the outgoing Prime Minister, Eden, his last act, Sir Anthony, recommended that Her Britannic Majesty send for Macmillan as PM. So 3 old Etonian Prime Ministers in a row, Sir Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and then Alec Douglas Hume. And it seemed like an Etonian would never be Prime Minister again, till along came David Cameron. Then we had a lady who went to a state school, Theresa May, and another old Etonian now. And the next leader of the Conservative Party, my hunch, is going to be Rishi Sunak, who's a Wickhamist, as in he went to Winchester. He'd be the first PM to come from Winchester College since Henry Addington. But back to Macmillan became Prime Minister in 1957. And if Eden was guilty over Suez, so was Macmillan. He was involved in that decision. But anyway, that wasn't officially why he stood down. So Labour was well ahead in the polls. The Conservatives really screwed up, but the economy was going well. And perhaps surprisingly, there was an election only 2.5 years later, and he managed to win that. I remember people saying this in 2003, just after the Iraq War. The Labour's position then in 2003 was redolent of the Conservatives in 1957. They'd started this war in the Middle East, which seemed to be very unpopular and based on dishonesty. Could they still pull off a victory a couple of years later? And they did, 2005, a narrow one. So then he had a growing economy. There was a lot more immigration from the Commonwealth. That was controversial. There were the Notting Hill race riots. So Oswald Mosley raised his ugly head. The leader of the British Union Fascists came here to fulminate against non-whites, to suggest they should be booted out. Anything else about Macmillan? Known as Supermac, told people he never had it so good. And he was right. There were a few strikes. There were rising incomes. Unemployment was very low. So life was getting better for people. It was turning into a consumerist society. Rationing was completely ended in 1958. The last item to be rationed was coal. 19 years of rationing. That's how much it took it out of the British economy, the Second World War. And he decided on decolonisation. The Suez was meant to prevent imperial retreat. In fact, it accelerated it, draw a line in the sand, not 1 inch more. But he said, well, why don't we just go back to the 18th century before there were substantial overseas possessions and just be rich? Their millstones around our necks. If they want independence, they can have it. We'll do it in short order. So despite having defeated Mau Mau and Kenya elsewhere, he said, let's fast-track this process and grant independence to all these colonies. Some of them have been granted independence already, like the Gold Coast, that was already in process by the time Macmillan took over. That was said to be exceptional. No, they will all have independence. He famously flew to South Africa and addressed the Parliament there at Cape Town in his Winds of Change speech, saying, whether we like it or not, a wind of change is blowing through this continent from north to south. The growth of nationalism is a political fact, saying that the colonies wanted independence. Here in South Africa was already effectively independent, the Union of South Africa, but the white minority, perhaps 30% of the population then, monopolized political power to the exclusion of the black majority and indeed the Asian and coloured minorities. And he said, well, this is no longer acceptable. You've got to make significant concessions to the black majority, even if you don't grant complete equality. You've got to go some way towards it. Anyway, so Hendrik French Verwoerd was the Prime Minister at the time, and he was mortally offended, delivered a speech in flawless English, which was unusual for an Afrikaner at the time, saying that he thought this was highly impertinent, didn't like it one bit. So apartheid was going at the time, and South Africa was about to be expelled from the Commonwealth in 1962, just after the Sharpeville massacre, about to be booted out because of apartheid. But they held a referendum, white-only referendum. Do you want to leave the Commonwealth and therefore get rid of the monarchy, become a republic? Majority of them did. So that was the end of the monarchy there. Incidentally, the Queen, she was Queen of South Africa at the time of the Sharpeville massacre. Not that she ordered it. Anyway, so some achievements under him. He had some good rapport with Jack Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was president at the time. Someone born, quite a lot after him, 1917. Good chemistry, even though I suppose they're very different people. And Macmillan was always rather old-fashioned, seeming a generation older than he was, and dressed in rather county style, three-piece tweed suits and so on. Even though his background was decidedly bourgeois, he was not blue blood and broad acres. But the Grouse-Moore image went down well with some conservatives, working class Tories too, deferential voters who believed that patricians should rule, were just tugging the forelock automatically to the horsed classes. Anyhow, so some of his advice was never do three things: never pick a fight with the trades unions, the Catholic Church, and never march on Moscow. So in 1963, he was afflicted with prostate problems, and he decided he had to retire on health grounds. It was October 1963. The Profumo scandal had struck. Jack Profumo, the Minister for War, we now say Defence Secretary, was having an affair with Christine Keeler, and she was also being pumped for information by Yevgeny Ivanov, who was the Soviet naval attaché. And the idea is that her pillow talk with the defense minister, military secrets, which she's then passing on to the Soviet embassy. That's never proven, but anyway, a security leak. But Profumo lied in the House, as in that's under oath. He never prosecuted for that, even though it's perjury. Lied to the House of Commons, said he denied any impropriety with Miss Keeler, this 19-year-old prostitute. But that's not true. It was impropriety. So the party was increasingly unpopular. There wasn't enough economic growth, and Labour seemed the new party. Hugh Gaitskell died in January 1963. What else? So then Harold Wilson had taken over, the Labour leader, and he was making the running. And every man coming from middle-class family in Huddersfield, represented Huyton at a constituency just outside Liverpool, someone more ordinary people could identify with, didn't have this cut-glass accent. Anyway, it looked like the Conservatives were going to be whacked in the upcoming general election. So Macmillan decided it's time to bow out. He was ill. He couldn't go to the Queen to resign, so she had to come to him in hospital and see him there in his pyjamas and dressing gown. And he resigned, and his last act was to advise her to send for Alec Douglas Hume as the new Prime Minister. Now, Douglas Hume was in the House of Lords. He was the Earl of Hume, the 14th Earl of Hume, so it's a title relating to somewhere in North Britain. He wasn't even a member of Parliament. So this new lord come in because of Viscount Stansgate, better known as Tony Benn, who'd inherited a title he didn't want, an MP for Bristol, who'd renounced the title, and you couldn't legally renounce it, been re-elected in a by-election, a Labour man against a Conservative, turned up to the House of Commons to take a seat, but he wasn't allowed in because he was a Lord. He couldn't be in the House of Commons. So the court said his Conservative opponent who got fewer votes was the MP for the constituency. They went through that rigmarole 3 times. So the final law was changed. You were allowed to disclaim a peerage. You can get rid of a peerage. You can't give it to a relative. If you renounce it, you renounce it for your family forever. You can't reclaim it. So actually, Lord Hume was able to avail himself of this and renounce his hereditary title and get himself elected in a by-election. And I think he wasn't even an MP or even in the House of Lords when he became Prime Minister, if I've got that right. And the by-election was a few days later. So then he became Prime Minister. So then he was Prime Minister, but he was already Prime Minister, but he became an MP. Don't ask me for which constituency. So he served as Prime Minister for exactly 1 year and 1 day, from October 63 to October 64. So that was Edward Macmillan, who was ennobled in the House of Lords as the Earl of Stockton after his constituency in the northeast, and he was there till he died in about 1985. Sort of grand old man of Toryism, and a focus for the opposition to Thatcher within the party, people who liked his suave and more restrained style. It was non-ideological, whereas they thought she was a termagant. She was driven, and her father was a shopkeeper. Oh, horror of horrors. There were various things to hold against her. So apparently he disagreed with some of what she was doing, thought it was divisive, and she was like a bull in a china shop, with her privatizations. Or the Falklands 1982, when the United Kingdom fought to regain these islands in the South Atlantic that the Argentines had taken. People saw shades of Suez, so there's going to be a calamity. And also, you can't do anything without American approval. And there was grudging American approval then. But actually, the Falklands campaign turned out to be a triumph for the UK. So that's Macmillan, just a few musings on Harold Macmillan. So please donate if you like this channel. Donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. It's all small letters. Callahan spelled Callahan. No donations too small. Please check me out on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Look at my law channel, my poesy channel, and I teach all sorts of subjects online. Toodaloo.